How's everybody doing this morning? Longtime friend of mine. I'm a proud owner of a couple of pieces of Paul's Pottery. If you've followed Paul's Pottery, you realize that generally when the show opens at 1 o'clock on Friday, generally by about 3:30 on Friday, Paul is sold out. He has a very devoted following, and he is very passionate about the art and the craft of what he does. So I'd like to introduce to you Paul Katrich.
Thank you, Bruce, for that very generous introduction, and I'm delighted that you could all be here so early in the morning. It's very flattering to have a room full of so many people. I know everybody's got a lot of things to do, so it's nice to have you here. Two things before I begin. Number one, I am about the most technologically incompetent person that ever drew breath on God's green earth, and they've just introduced me to a new device that I get to experiment with. It has 3 buttons. There's a laser pointer, a forward, and a backwards. In the throes of doing this, I get very emotionally involved. I'm liable to back off the stage and fall backwards, get tangled up in this stuff like a spider. The more benevolent among you, if you see this about to happen, scream, maybe we can stop it before it happens, okay? Nothing else. The other thing too is that I've got a great many images here, and I don't want to linger over too many of them. A lot of pretty pictures that my friend George Lee spent a lot of time assembling. And I'd like to. I'm going to reserve the right to deviate from the script as the spirit moves me. And if somebody's got a question that just won't wait, shout it out. You're not going to throw me off my game. So why don't we begin where we're at the beginning? The arts and crafts era, some of the most interesting, experimental and avant-garde things were occurring in the realm of ceramics, as opposed to some of the other. A lot of interesting things are happening at the time. But ceramics represent an unusual coming together of science, industry, and leisure time in the service of art. It's also the first time in the United States and other parts of the world that important collections of ancient and historical pottery were being assembled and are available to people to study for the first time and to investigate and see the entire world sweep of what ceramics have to offer. Aesthetic and technical risks were being taken with pottery that were not deemed feasible in other mediums, such as, it's not novelty and experimentation is the order of the day. There are things that are adaptable to ceramics and risks that people felt free to take that probably wouldn't have been adaptable to a table or a chair or something else. Somehow the potters were often let off their leash in a way that other mediums weren't so much. I mean, in furniture you have people like Charles Rolfs and such that are very avant-garde, but most furniture is brown. Pottery was allowed to go as far off the gamut as it wished to be. And, let's see where we're at here. Also, the most importantly, perhaps, the aesthetic possibilities of existing technology and techniques, the things that may have existed for centuries were being seen as beautiful for the first time, or being used as a lot of things. Ceramics is a very old medium. It has a 10,000-year history. But the people working in this era, which is now often being referred to as the American Renaissance, really brought a lot of things together for the first time that they made new out of what was very old. So the first image that's up is a piece of artist Van Briggle's work, which I'm briefly running through about 10 examples of things that I think are broadly encapsulate what was new in the arts and crafts era. Of course, there's nothing more quintessentially arts and crafts than the matte green glaze, and if anyone is to be credited with bringing that into being, it was probably artist Van Briggle while he was working at Rookwood. Let's advance to the next slide. This is a piece of Pewabic pottery by Mary Chase Perry Stratton. Another new innovation, the true inglaze lusters, which is probably being seen for the first time in this time period in all of history. Oxblood red, the elusive holy grail of pottery making. This is a piece of Chelsea ceramic by Hugh Robertson at Chelsea Dedham Potteries, and he's again being seen in modern times in Western cultures for the very first time in this era. The volcanic glaze. I'm going to deviate a little bit here. There's no word in pottery jargon more misused than the word volcanic. It really has no meaning, and I apologize for using it at all. In this case, I'm talking about a glaze that stands proud off the surface, as it does on this piece of George Orr. This is something that occurs in other pottery. In pottery, generally, if a glaze is overfired or underfired, but Orr is probably the first person in modern history to have seen it as something that was aesthetically beautiful and not a horrible defect. Crystalline glazes. They go back a little earlier. I think the French can probably be the ones attributed. These are University City potteries from the St. Louis, but the French probably can be credited with first inventing these large macrocrystalline glazes or discovering them. But this is the first time period where they're really being utilized aesthetically. Another thing that deviates, whether this should even be called a glaze, but a very original concept. These are pieces of Cluel pottery from Ohio, and those are electroplated metal on top of a blank ceramic base that have been patinated with its own special formula. And electroforming is a very new technology around that time, and it certainly had never been adapted to pottery before maybe the 1870s or 80s, so this is all new right then. Okay. This, very arts and crafts, isn't it? Okay. I wanted to throw this as a curve because this is one era that it really gets neglected. This sort of very beginning of the arts and crafts movement from a pottery standpoint. Of course, this is an 18th century piece of Sèvres porcelain, but it's painted by what is called the China paint method, which is overglazed enamel. I'm going to harp on this a little bit because I've never ever heard anybody talk about it before. All these beautiful, I realize that the aesthetic of this might not please you, but let me be assured that this is as fine a craftsmanship as anything Rookwood ever made, and it's just a question of style, time, and circumstance. This is actually a potpourri container for flowers and fragrance for somebody excessively wealthy. But this is a blank piece of porcelain. This would have been a white glazed thing, but all of these colors that you see on them were adapted and developed to paint over the top of it to add life to it. And it requires astounding skill to be able to paint with that level of nicety. But these same techniques, the same materials that were being used to decorate a piece like this would also be used as a very typical American China paint piece, such as you see here. All of the art pottery that you can think of that you love, that we collect, be it Gruby, Tico, the 100 others that could be named, start from this sort of place. This is the time, experimentally, when the people... China paint is basically, I realize a lot of people have never probably actually seen it being utilized before. China paint is little pretty colored vials of color, little powders. They have to be mixed into an oil, like olive oil, oil lavender, and they can be made in sort of a little paste, and then they can be painted onto almost any white blank and fired at a low temperature, and then they fuse permanently onto the piece. It's nice because it really does function very much like oil paint. The colors more or less look like what they're going to look like all the way through the end. And it became a polite hobby. These things that had been in industry for 20 years moved into the realm of the hobbyist, and for the first time, people felt the liberty to be able to play with it, and for the first time, a lot of people were starting to use kilns and make ceramics for themselves as opposed to something that was made in factories. Another thing, this ugly but very consequential device about the size of a large water heater is a Revelation kiln. Another thing that you can thank the great and very underappreciated Mary Chase Stratton from the Pottery for bringing to the market. This kiln and kilns of its type were the first small adaptable kilns that allowed somebody to have a studio pottery, do all things flow. They don't get super hot. They were very good for the China paint. China paint fires at about, you can fire it acceptably at about 1500, 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. For a frame of reference, stoneware and porcelain fires at about 2300 degrees Fahrenheit. The capacity of a kiln like this was probably maybe 1700 degrees. And they have a very unfortunate kerosene drip mechanism for feeding them, so you can imagine how dangerous they are to use. But her partner, Horace Calkins, was a dentist, and they developed this for dental work originally, but everything that you love about pottery starts here.